Okay, so next to me we have Honda's longest running dual sport, the XR650l. Now this bike was originally released in 1992 as a 1993 model year, and it's still sold today across dealer showrooms across the country. You will find this bike for a retail price of $69.99 before freight and setup. However, if you look past the bold new graphics, this bike is largely unchanged since its release in 1992. They've removed a couple grease zerks, they've tweaked the suspension a couple times, and that's really about it. So we've got kind of a time warp journey back to the year 1992. If we turn to the CRF450l, this was released in late 2018 as a 2019 model year for a wallet-draining $10,399. Now previously on this channel, we compared the 450l against my dad's 250l, which at $51.99 is exactly 50% cheaper than this one. So if you haven't seen that video before, I'll put the link in the description below and be sure to check that out after this video. But for today we want to focus on the big bore bikes. We want to know that we bought the bikes with enough power. When we twist that throttle, we don't want to be sitting there wishing we had more because we bought a smaller motor. Now for today, I'm going to caveat right away, we're not trying to determine which bike's better. The better bike's the 450. It's got better power, better chassis. I enjoy it more, and I've owned both. But what we're actually trying to answer today is, was this bike worth waiting 26 years for? Has 26 years of technology and evolution made it worth the wait? Or, if you've still got your 650s, should you just keep it and keep motoring on? So that's the question we're going to answer today. So be sure to subscribe to the channel and stick around to see what you think is the better option. Okay, so to keep today organized, I've got notes, and we're going to look at this into 4 different categories. We're going to look at the motor and maintenance, the suspension and chassis, the tech on the bikes, and we're actually going to compare them to their cousins, the XR650R and CR450X, because they're important pieces of the time history. So let's move right away to everybody's favorite part, and that's the motor. All right, so starting with the 650, 1992 is not far enough back yet for this bike. We actually have to look at the NX650 Dominator as the first bike that Honda ever released that featured this 650 motor, and that was released in 1988. And for historical purposes, that NX650 was sold from the years 1988 to 2003. So you still might see some of those out there. However, though, this motor didn't actually start in 1988. We gotta go even further back than that. This motor started with the XR600, and Honda simply bored and stroked it up to 644 cc's. No, to get the true origin of this bike's engine, we have to go back to the year 1985.
Now I need your help to get back to the year 1985.
Okay, so the carburetor-fed 650L produces about 31 horsepower at 6,000 RPM and peak torques at a very low 3,800 RPM at about 30. I'm just going to be honest with you guys. There is no top-end rev to this motor. This motor is all low-end grunt, short shift it, and you'll have a good time. In fact, I would say that when I owned this bike, I loved shifting out of first gear to second. For one reason, first gear was too short, but two, when you hit second gear, that low end grunt just propelled you forward in just like a tractor-like fashion. It felt like a diesel bike. Just a very, very fun transition that you got to do all the time, every time you accelerated. So now on the 450L, this bike's been dynoed in at 38 rear horsepower at 7,400 RPM and 28 foot-pounds of torque at 6,500 RPM. Now, I will tell you that with this bike, the peak numbers and where they occur don't matter as much, because with the fuel injection, this bike's pretty much torquey all the way around on the bottom. Yes, it peaks all the way up at 6,500, but there's plenty of torque down low, and this bike will rev smoothly up to the 10,000 rev limiter. The 650, I don't think that has a rev limiter because it won't do it. You can leave it cracked wide open, it just doesn't have the gas to do it. It's like asking Homer Simpson to sprint. He's winded way before he ever gets to top speed. So speaking of running out of gas, you're looking at stock mile per gallon of around 50 miles per gallon on the 450L. I've seen up to 60 in a video I did, just cruising on the back roads. And the 650L is going to be about 40 to 42. With a 2-gallon gas tank and a 2.3-gallon gas tank, a lot of people are going to look for an aftermarket tank and or a rack so they can mount a fuel can in the back. One of the negatives I'll give on the 450L right now is that for emissions purposes, The ECU on here will cut off fuel delivery when the bike's rolling and you let go of the gas. That cuts there. So if the bike's not squirting fuel, there's no emissions, better efficiency, and that's one of the things Honda needed to do to pass. However, as you give it gas again to come back, there's a little bit of a jerk to it, a hesitation that I and a lot of people have complained about. A couple different ways to fix it, but the only true way to do it is to replace the computer entirely with a Vortex ECU, which we will be doing on this channel later. But then at that point, the motor quits doing that behavior and you get the extra power. On here, the 650L benefits from kind of more traditional modding methods. You don't have to spend $700 on an ECU. You go buy a $70 jetting kit, open up the air box, remove the smog kit, which you can find plates on eBay for a couple bucks, and you've got a noticeable power gain on here. And then from there, if you want to do the exhaust, that's not a problem as well. Exhaust is going to run a lot cheaper over here on the 650 than the typical $700 exhaust you have on the 450. So when it comes to maintenance, that's probably one of the biggest areas of difference that's worth pointing out between these bikes. This bike is 600 miles between oil changes, however, it's very easy to change. This bike is 2,000 miles between oil changes, and because the oil runs inside the frame, it does take a little bit longer to change, but it's really not a big deal. Valves on here are easy to check, and you don't have to tear the motor apart. Over here, you got to check the valves every 1,800 miles, and while it's a little more intensive, it's still pretty easy to do, to take the tank off and go in there with the feelers and get it checked out. Now, Honda specs a full rebuild at 20,000 miles. There's stories of XR650Ls going over 100,000 miles, so a rebuild really, just like the 250L, is not a concern on this side. So depending on your use, at the end of the day, I still feel like the 450L's engine runs away with this category. It's smoother, more powerful, and with the fuel injection on there, if you find yourself up in the woods, you don't got to worry about tuning. It's just going to run. If you are worried about pounding out the miles though, and you're going to be putting a lot of road miles on, the 650L starts to creep back up into this category because of its longer lasting life and easy ability and cheap, affordable ability to mod the motor. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that this motor is derived from the CRF450R, even though it's a different cam and everything on here. But if you go to San Diego Powerhouse for about 2,500 bucks, you can get a kit to pop this up about 19 horsepower, which is more than a stock 450R. However, if you don't know how to change the valve springs yourself and put a new cam in, you will need to hire that work done. All right, thankfully both of these bikes are pretty much stock, so this will be a really fair comparison. So we're gonna head out to the street and do a quick little drag race and just see at the end of the day what happens when you try to put this power to the ground. Okay, so now that the engine's out of the way, and even though I gave this crown to the 450L, you guys might pick the 650L as the winner. We want to look at the suspension and chassis of these two bikes. Now, originally when I planned on putting this video together, I wanted to think if there was a way we could go out and jumping them. We still got some snow in the back, but my brother-in-law stopped me real quick, and he made a good point. He's like, we don't jump dump trucks, and so we don't go around jumping the 650L. And he actually made a really good point with that. This bike right here is 350 pounds against this bike's 290 pounds. It's a 60-pound weight difference on here. Furthermore, the springs on here are 43 millimeters up front for the forks, and these are 49 millimeters. This bike was never really designed to be out jumping. This bike's meant to go out and hit the trails. Now, I will say what's cool about this bike is the forks are air adjustable with 16 position adjustments, so you can tune the 650 into the type of riding you're doing. If you want to see the 650L taken to its max capability, I'm going to put a link in the description below to a video from Torture Test magazine. He runs the crap out of that thing, and so it really gives you a good demonstration of what this bike all out's capable of. Now, speaking of the forks on here, so the suspension on this bike is straight from the 450R. In fact, the front fork tubes had the same stock springs in them. Now, the one disappointment on here I will say is this bike is only rated for a stock weight limit of 220 pounds. And that's including the rider and gear, which we're gonna do a separate video about because I think that's way too low. But as it is, there are no rear passenger foot pegs on here, whereas on the 650L you have rear passenger pegs and you have a rider and cargo weight limit of 328 pounds. Now, however, as much as I don't like that weight limit, what's nice about the suspension on here is it's really easy to tune. So what I did in a previous video is I bought the optional stiffer springs for the 450R and put them on this bike, which took my spring rate from 0.51 to 0.53 up front, and we put a 6.3 rear kg spring on the back. I'm in the process of trying to lose weight, but now with those stiffer springs, that's gonna give me the ability to jump it and ride it a little bit more aggressive for what I wanna do. It will sacrifice some on-road comfort, but I can put a softer seat on it later. Okay, so if you wanna see what the 450L can really do, I recommend, if you haven't seen it before, to watch Cole Seeley's video of the bike he did. He tore it all the way apart and built it back up, but the point is he takes a street legal bike out to a supercross track as a professional and rides a supercross track. It's really amazing. I actually, though, enjoyed Ivan Tedesco's video that he did riding the 650L on a motocross track, because near the end of the video, he whips this thing. I can't imagine whipping this 350-pound bike. So in some ways, that to me was more impressive. I'll put the link for both videos below. All right, so both of these bikes are pretty tall. I'm 6'3", and I'm comfortable on both, but installing a lowering link on this bike is a very, very common thing to do because it's such a tall bike. And one of the things that happens on here is with this steel chassis and this air-cooled motor at 350 pounds, if you're riding off-road and you start to tip over and you're not tall enough for it, this bike's a lot to catch and to hold on to, let alone if you dump it. Picking it back up can feel like a handful because this bike is a handful. Now, the other thing on here too that surprises me a little bit is I personally feel like with the height of this bike, the handlebars in the cockpit are a little too cramped down. So when I owned this machine, I put on Pro Taper bars with the Windham bend and some risers on here. And I really felt like for myself that opened it up a lot, because when I was standing on the bike or riding it, I just felt way too bent over and confined in the space. The other thing that I noticed with this bike is while it was really great on the pavement, when I found myself in very loose gravel, loose sand, something about the front end, the way it wanted to tuck, it just took me a very, very long time to feel comfortable with. It was a lot of practice before I was kind of sliding the rear end out a little bit more comfortably with this bike. It's not a bad bike, but the geometry setup of it just took me a while to adapt to. Okay, so sitting over on the 450L, the seat height's about the same. If you're comfortable on one, you're gonna be comfortable on the other. If you need a lowering link on that one, you're gonna need a lowering link on this one. But with this chassis setup, this definitely benefits from 26 years of engineering. The moment I got on this bike, this felt more natural to what I was used to. And riding it, it had that more modern feel to it. It was very similar to how my 450X and 450R felt as far as the type of riding positions that Honda was after on here. Not speaking bad of the 650, but this just instantly felt right. Now I have taken the stock bars out, which weren't bad, but I took them out, put my Windham bends back on with risers on here. And I will say that when I stand up and ride the bike more aggressively, this is just a setup that I'm more comfortable with. But also sitting on these bikes, the seat underneath me is straight from the 450R motocross bike. And so when I'm sitting here, I have a very narrow chassis. I can feel that it's more narrow than the 650L, and it's begging to be rode aggressively. And however, though, when you're just cruising on the road, this seat is hard as a 2x4, and it's very narrow too. So if you're gonna be putting the miles on it, I would definitely recommend moving to a seat concept seat or something more comfortable. The 650L with its wider seat is far more comfortable for long trips. So yes, while we were talking about the motor, there's all kinds of modern achievements on here, but I actually feel like the suspension and chassis of these two bikes is the greatest difference between the two. They're not even the same target. To even be fair though, this would have had to have been probably like a CR250 back in the day to get the same type of chassis feel. But I really feel like of all the different categories, this is the category where the 450L has benefited from the 26-year gap between that bike and the modern bike you have before you. Okay, so now we're on to our third category, and that's the technology between the bikes. And as CNET would say, where's the tech? Well, the 650L has none, but that's not a bad thing. Less tech means easier to work on. It means less things to go wrong. So as an example, even just the speedometer, this is gear driven, so if you change your sprockets, you don't gotta do anything. You gotta modify the computer on here with an inlay speedometer adjustment if you touch the 450L or 250L. We have traditional headlights, turn signals, and all the basic stuff you'd expect. Now over here on the 450L, we've got LED headlight, LED turn signals, LED brake light, lithium ion battery, and I've said it before, but most importantly, we have fuel injection. So while this bike over here walks away with this category, I would say of all the things Honda did, the fuel injection to me is the most important. Suzuki's had digital speedometers on their DRZ400 for a very long time, and you can add LED turn signals aftermarket. But at the end of the day, it's that fuel injection that really lets the new modern technology stand out on this 2019 bike. Okay, so now we're on to our final category, which is the CRF450X and the XR650R. And it might seem weird to include those cousin bikes in this video, but their history is actually very important. I've ran into a lot of people who think that the XR650L is actually a detuned XR650R, and it's not true actually. The XR650R wasn't released until the year 2000. Instead of a steel frame like this bike, it was aluminum. And the motor was completely different. Instead of being air-cooled, it was a liquid-cooled 649cc motor with about 35 horsepower. And that bike was begging to be opened up. With some simple mods, that bike was running up to 45 to 50 horsepower. It was a monster. And in fact, a lot of people have taken that bike and plated it. If you go look in your local Craigslist or local Cycle Trader, whatever ad system you have, you're probably gonna find a 650R that's been converted for dual sport use. And that led to a lot of people thinking, okay, Honda surely is gonna update this engine to be liquid cooled and some other features. But as we now know, that never happened. And so the XR650R was discontinued in 2008. Now over here, what was my first bike based in Honda's 450 lines was actually a 2005 450X. That bike came out in 2005, and again, it was based on Honda's 450R, but it did have a lot of trail changes done to it. A little bit different motor setup and everything. But again, okay, now that Honda's got a trail bike out there, surely a new dual sport's gonna come, right? And no, it never did. So what you saw a lot of people do with the 450X is they would plate those and convert them. However, there was a little bit of caution for people who did it. The engine, back then, the engine oil and transmission ran separate in those bikes. And so people were getting transmission failures in the 450X, running them for long periods of time in fifth gear on the road. So a common fix for that was to simply fill the transmission side with 1 full quart of oil. So it's been said many times before that one of the reasons why this bike hasn't been updated is because of the carburetor. If Honda wanted to make updates to this bike, they'd have to get it to pass modern day emissions. And with a carburetor fed bike, that's just simply not gonna happen. And so that's why for years Honda has come by and kept making this bike. So I and a lot of people wondered why we never got a new dual sport during that era. And a lot of people speculate that this bike is grandfathered into the 1992 emissions that Honda passed. By not changing anything on here, they're still allowed to make it to this day. However, if they wanted to make changes or make either of those bikes, the 450X or the 650R street legal, they would have had to have then passed emissions at that time. And it probably just was not going to happen on a carbureted bike. However, again, when Honda released fuel injection in 2009 for the 450R, we thought surely maybe we're getting closer to that happening. Well, Honda never even updated the old 450X to fuel injection. They left a carburetor until they discontinued it and brought out the new 450X in 2019. So I don't really know what Honda was sitting around waiting for. But thankfully, companies like KTM and others moved forward with dual sports, and they proved that there is a market for these machines. So with everything said and done between these two bikes, with a $3,400 MSRP difference, I do believe that sticker to sticker, this bike is worth paying $3,400 for. You are getting $3,400 worth of additional bike out of it in stock form. Now, if you can find a 650L used, which happens all the time, and especially a low mileage one, you might find one for anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000. That might all of a sudden be a much better buy than brand new at $7K with the freight and setup added on top of it. So at the beginning of the video, we wanted to answer the question, was this bike worth waiting for? Was this bike worth the 26, almost 30 years that passed before Honda released a new big bore dual sport? So at the end of the day, no. Sadly, no, this bike was not worth waiting 26 years for compared to the 650L. If you didn't wait and you bought one of these, there's nothing wrong with that. And if you don't want to sell it to spend the money to get a new one, keep riding this one. Or maybe you have a different bike. There's so many out there. The KLR 650, the Suzuki DR 650, KTM, whatever you may have. If those bikes are suiting you, there's no real reason just to rush out and jump and hop into this one, as much as I'd like to see everybody have the Honda. So yes, while this bike is better and it has benefited from the engineering, no. I almost feel like for 26 years of waiting, this bike should have more features than it does. And again, I'm a Honda fan, so this isn't me bashing Honda, but at the same time, I'm never a fan of any brand enough where I won't be a critic of them as well. And speaking of other brands, there is another brand I am fond of, and that's Yamaha. Yamaha has a reputation of actually in their 450s having better valve train reliability than Honda. And considering how good their WR450 and YZ450F is, I'm hoping that they come out with a 450 of their own to bring additional competition into this market. So at the end of the day, we as consumers win. There's now another bike on the market that gives you an option to pick from, and with the more bikes on the market, the more competitive manufacturers are with each other, that helps keep pricing down and puts features up. So at this point, what do you guys think? Do you agree with me? Did we get it right, or do you have some different thoughts? If you do, put them in the comments below, and we'll be sure to take a look and see what everybody else thinks as well. Otherwise, thanks for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, thanks for watching.